Shinji, do you want to do the introduction?
Sure. Let me introduce Jonathan. He's now Gettysburg College, and Jonathan is one of my one of the most important collaborators. He actually we started to get to know each other 2018 or 19, and then our kind of at that time. We didn't know each other, or we didn't know each of the background, but Jonathan's the project, Endangered language documentation, was really impressed by me. And then also I was also impressed by his kind of a very well the arranged data, so that the researchers, the speech engineers can easily start this kind of very interesting, important project. So I was since then we have actually a lot of discussion, communications, and actual collaborations. So today I'm really glad to Jonathan to be virtually here and have a talk about his study about automatic speech recognition and endangered language documentation. So yeah, Jonathan, please start that.
Okay. Yeah, I want to thank Shinji as well. I remember when I first met you at Johns Hopkins. I had mentioned this before we went online. I was totally shocked when one of the first sort of requests that Shinji made was to share my data with everybody and put it up on OpenSLR, and then put his algorithms, his ASR recipes in GitHub. And for most academics, sharing data before it's published is like, don't go there. Don't ask them to do that. And I have been with people on very similar projects, endangered language documentation, where there's been a concern about even archiving the material, because once you archive it, other people can get it. So one of the things that's been fantastic for me is working not only in a collaborative way with Shinji and Jiatang, but just opening up the door to future collaborations and to making the data available to anybody really who wants to use it. So I got my degree in 2000, and I started working on Nawat, and I realized that very few people collect large data sets of languages and document them, and just sort of lived on grants since that time, working on endangered languages, Nahuatl, Mixtec, Totonac, and now 6 other languages in Oaxaca. So let me just start now. And what is endangered language documentation? So endangered language documentation is the documentation, which means the creation of primary resources for languages that are in danger of disappearing in a very short time frame. So people have debated how many languages there are and how many languages are disappearing. What actually is language loss? So is language shift the same as language loss? At what point does a language become so changed by an impact of a colonial language that we can say it doesn't really exist anymore, or it's a hybrid language? So those are all questions that can be dealt with. And I found that one thing that I do when I go into a village is I look for there was a term in Nahuatl that the well-informed informant, when people talked about colleagues in indigenous villages as informants, but well-informed informants is you look for somebody who knows what you need. So when I go into a village and I try to do endangered language documentation, I do have a bias. And the bias is people who are fluent in the language, who are not using a lot of loan words, whose syntaxis is not completely changed because of the influence, in this case, of Spanish, et cetera, et cetera. So I can say good speakers, right? People who are fluent in their language. And so that's what I do. And I go in there and I try to get as much documentation as possible, which means recording, and then transcribe it. And eventually segment it into the morphemes gloss it, and translate it. So that's the creation of a corpus. So here we see the sort of the three. Franz Boas was an anthropologist, a famous anthropologist that lived at the beginning of the 1900s. And he said there are three basic elements in a documentation corpus or project. The corpus itself, which is the recorded audio or video, usually transcribed, segmented, glossed, and translated. The lexicon, and here we was referring to the lexicon, a dictionary, and then a grammar. In recent years, people have really tried to focus on corpus-based. It started, I think, with co-build in English. I don't know, people might be more informed about this, but where your examples for a dictionary are taken from actual speech, the same with grammar. So among these three elements of a documentation project, corpus is, my Latin is not good. What is it? Primus inter pares, or whatever the Latin, first among equals or first among pairs. The corpus is really, in some ways, a basis for further development of lexicon and grammar, because it gives a lot of examples that can be used. Corpus is something which automatic speech recognition is particularly appropriate for, right? Because you have the audio and you're trying to create a transcription. You're trying to segment it, gloss it, and translate it. I think that a project that we're, and let me show you how this material is. So this is a program called ELAN, which was developed at the Max Planck Institute. And it is sort of the go-to tool for language documentation. It's an XML format. It can be archived as a text. People who are familiar with programming languages can easily extract the material from it. And I'm just going to show you what this is and then play the sound. And I hope you can hear it, but Shinji also said that he distributed a package of the sound. So these are the, Esteban Castillo is one speaker. There are two forms, and I'll explain this. There's the practical orthography, somewhat underlying form. And here you can see in this thing, you have an equal sign here, which this is an enclitic. Okay, it refers to a subject that is wood. Okay, so Mishtek has separate enclitics for third person, and there's one for wood and there's one for water, along with male and female, and first person, second person, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the enclitic, meaning that the subject of the, actually it's not a subject, this means arm or branch. So it's the tree's branch. So it would be its arm, where it is a wooden, an object made out of wood, okay? And I've underlined these because you can see the difference here between the underlying form and the surface form. So in the surface form, we've just done something very simple, which was mark the nasalization with a tilde above the vowel, okay? And eliminated here the enclitic marker. So it's all run together, okay? Here we have vowel harmonization. We have the creation of an onset, a glide, which is nasalized. And again, we have the elimination of the enclitic in the surface form, right? There's no enclitic here. There's an enclitic here marked with the equal sign and A with the second tone, and vowel harmonization across. Okay. And here we have a prefix, which is an encodative prefix, to become, and a verb. And here again, it's just, we've gotten rid of the morphological marker that separates out the prefix. When we did this project, we did something that's sort of backwards from the way most people do it. We wrote in this orthography, and then we generated the surface forms through a finite state transducer that was built upon the grammar of my native speaker colleague, Ray Castillo Garcia. And the problem of that is that we are predicting the surface form. We're not transcribing the surface form. So if we see something here is ba'a, which is good, and which is a third person marker, singular third person. And here, when Ray says it, he goes be'e. So we have the E is harmonizing, I guess, across the glottal stop. This apostrophe here that's hard to see is a glottal stop. Not all speakers will do that. So some people might say ba'e instead of be'e, okay? But since we've generated this surface form from the underlying form, it might not reflect the actual sound. I hope that's okay. I can't see people actually. If people have a question, and if anybody has a question, they want to interrupt me, please feel free to do so. So why did I do it this way when most people do a transcription and then parse it or segment it into the morphemes? The reason is that I didn't want to become dependent on a transducer, and I wanted to be able to find the stems. So if we have this ba'a, which is a low tone, mid-high tone, and it means good. If I wanted to find that and I had this form be'e, which is it's good or it is good, I'd have to parse it out or segment it. And I didn't want to do that, or I didn't want to have to do that. So we wrote it this way, and then we generated the surface form. Okay. So that creates certain problems, of course, right? Because the surface form might not reflect the actual speech signal. So let me play it again, and you can look at these things and you can maybe hear some of it. And you can also hear the quality of the sound.
Okay,
so the goal of endangered language documentation is to take sound and put it in this format. Let us say that's it, okay? And it's an extrinsic goal, or you evaluate the success of your project on the basis of evaluating your ability to meet that goal. So things like character error recognition, word error recognition are sort of incidental. There's obviously a relationship between your ability to get a transcription and the CER and the WER, but they're not immediately, they're different goals, right? Intrinsic versus extrinsic. And one of the things we find is that you can maybe reduce the human effort to get a final transcription through very trivial processes, like better annotation interface, and things like that. So there's a certain point where your character error recognition, character error rate gets very low, where even a 10% improvement in your CER is really not going to impact the amount of human effort it takes to get a final transcription, right? So there's a divergency of goals in a way. Let's go on to the next. Okay. I'm going to now talk about 6 different elements or 6 different characteristics of endangered language documentation and how it affects or impacts the relationship of endangered language documentation to automatic speech recognition. Okay, the first is, this is commonly known as the transcription bottleneck. The transcription bottleneck means that you can go out and record scores or dozens or hundreds of hours of material, and that's it. So I can go into Yoloshochits, where I have had a really good experience and a lot of help with people in the community, and working hard, I can get maybe 30 hours of good quality recordings in a week. And there's only one person who can transcribe that material. And it will generally take 40+ hours to transcribe it in the format that we saw here, right? So that means you're getting close to the fact that in 1 week of field work, you can create enough material for 1 year of transcription. In 2 weeks of field work, you get 2 years. So it is a big problem, right? What do you do with all this audio data? And one of the obvious answers, more and more it's being looked at, is the use of ASR to transcribe the material. Okay, there's a difference. How can I put it? I gave a talk once where I talked about my child when she was 2 years old, and she entered something, what's called the why stage, where everything was why, like we're going to go to the store. Why? Oh, because I didn't go yesterday. Why? Oh, because I was busy. Why? They just give it. So when you ask of why you're doing ASR, you know, there's an answer to it. It could be just an exercise in it, or it could be a specific downstream goal, right? So you might develop different ASR systems for like a phone answering system than you would for captioning a talk, a Supreme Court speech, or captioning a movie, et cetera, closed captioning, et cetera. So for ELD, the goal is to create transcribed audio in this system, in this program, or something very similar, that is really accurate. Why is it really accurate? Because nobody's going to look at it. Nobody might ever look at it, but people might not look at it for hundreds of years, right? We're archiving it. So you can't go to somebody, oh, is this a typo? Is that a typo? You know, you need to expend a little bit extra effort in going over it. So I think that, at least for me, a consideration is that we never want to just produce ASR and say we've reached this level of accuracy or something like that. Let's just leave it at that. There's always going to be a human proofing of the ASR, no matter how good it is, right? So that's the thing. And the goal is to reduce that effort, right? Reduce the effort it takes somebody to go over the ASR hypothesis and create a really good, tight transcription. Okay. The final, what's the final format we want? We don't want just a transcription. We want it segmented into morphemes. We want the morphemes glossed, and in the best of all cases, we want a free translation, right? So that's like the ultimate goal. And one of the questions that came up last year when we were working on a NSF proposal was maybe we can go straight from the audio and get all this done in one sweep, right? Go straight from audio to a interlinear format. And we haven't done that right now with the work that I've done with Shinji and Jiatang. It's all been getting transcriptions of the underlying form. Okay, that's good. How can we evaluate? Okay, I know that I didn't know any of these terms, but you have CER, WER, character error rate, word error rate. I like character error rate because it's a better indication to me to the amount of time that it might take somebody to correct it. But basically for the endangered language documentation, we have an extrinsic goal, right? And the evaluation is if we've met that goal or how far have we gone towards meeting that goal. Lowering CER is not an extrinsic goal in and of itself, right? So what I'm interested in and what we did in one associate was actually measure the impact in terms of human effort of ASR. Okay. Another problem with applying endangered language documentation to ASR is that most people work on endangered language documentation don't think about ASR when they're designing their project, right? So they might have bad recording conditions. They might have you know, a single omnidirectional mic with 4 people speaking. I don't know if this is the cocktail party scenario or something like that, where everybody's talking at once. That's not really something that endangered language documentation works on, right? There's a limit to the utility of having 6 people talk in a room and overlapping speech. That's a problem for ASR, but it's not really a goal of endangered language documentation. So one of the things that I've developed, and since working with Shinji, I want to go about gathering my data and to make it not necessarily super challenging for ASR, but at least something that we can work on ASR with a good recording environment. So I've tried to get the best recordings possible, knowing that that will be used for an ASR system. And that means separate mics for each speakers, high quality mics. I've spent a lot of money on recorders, sound devices, recorders that are close to professional models, et cetera, et cetera. So we're getting very good sound now. Orthographic choices. I think when we went back, we saw the possibility of an underlying or surface forms. It doesn't have necessarily an impact on ASR. So we did an experiment, Xietang did an experiment on 2 targets, underlying and surface transcription of Yoloshochi-Mishtek, and there was no real difference in the accuracy. But there is a difference in how close you're getting to your final goal, right? So the more segmented the orthography, the more you're going along to your final goal is getting transcribed, segmented, and glossed annotations. And the other thing that I've become interested in through Shinji's impact is, okay, so one of the problems of endangered language documentation is there are a lot of communities where there's a lot of variation. The languages might be mutually intelligible, they might be problematic for a speaker of one community to understand a speaker to the other, but they're considered a single language, but with significant differences. So how can we develop ASR for one language, Quetzala, Nahuatl, or Yoloshochi-Mishtek, and extend it to other languages, other related languages? So the NSF project we have right now is to develop ASR for Quetzala Nahuatl, and then extend it to 4 other Nahuatl languages spoken in the East Mexico. And the goal is to get this transfer knowledge working with 100 hours of audio and 10 hours of transcription in the related languages. So that's what we're doing right now, is building that up. So let's go. Let's just look at, I mentioned the difference between accuracy and depending upon the morphology, and where there's no morphological. Remember, we got rid of the enclitic markers, we got rid of the prefix markers, we marked nasalization with a tilde, and here we see the character error rate, and the underlying, we have some morphology. Okay, not completely segmented, but some morphology. And I'll go into what exactly we did. So what we can see here is there's no reason not to use the underlying morphology, which is getting us along the goal towards producing a transcribed, segmented gloss text. Here's an example of these are from the first ELAN file that I showed you. And you can see the difference between the underlying and surface. Okay. And the ASR system had just as much success in transcribing this as in transcribing that. Okay. Let's look at something that's not, that's a little bit problematical, is tonal derivation, tone used for derivational and for inflectional morphology. So here's an intransitive, it's ta bi, and this is the transitive ta bi. Okay, so here the tone shift from 1 to 3 is transitivizing. That's commonly known. It's not that easy to parse out automatically, I think. I'm not quite sure how that would work. But it's certainly difficult to write, right? So when you're transcribing it, I mean, do you transcribe this and add the 3 as a translitizer? In a way, it's equipolar. We're not sure what the direction of because it's natural to think we're transitivizing, but there are, of course, detransitivizing morphology. And so somebody could argue that we're really detransitivizing. Here's some other tonal morphology. The 1-4, which is a rising tone, is a negative of the irrealis future, you might say. Okay. The 4 irrealis into a habitual aspect. And the low tone, here it's with the intransitive in the irrealis, but here you can see it's marked with a 1-3. So this is other types of morphology that we'd want to parse out if we could. And it was too much of a trouble to, it was too hard to do that in the original transcription, but that's like a future goal. And even though Mishtek is a relatively simple language morphologically as compared to Nahuatl that do not exist in Nahuatl, which is pretty linear. So ni meets palewis in Nahuatl is ni, I, meets to you, palewi, the future stem of the verb to help, and the S is the future irrealis. So ni meets palewi says, I will help you. And it's just concatenated, right? It's just one after the other. Whereas here you have sort of more of a, I don't know, I'm not a linguist, so to say, but more something you might auto-segmental tier. Let's go to the next one.
There is a Jonathan. There is a the question from the student. Tone
Okay.
IPA. That was the question.
I'm sorry. What was the question?
The tone mentioned is in IPA or not?
Which transcription? No, it's not in we never use IPA.
Okay.
We use just the reason IPA is that data entry on ELAN is just complicated, and it's easier to convert this to an IPA system than to type in the IPA. So so we don't use IPA. Also, when you do search, let's say online searches and things like that, if we want to put the dictionary online, IPA searches are a bit more problematical, right, for typing things in. So, but I don't think it makes any difference. So you can use a, like like practical orthography and still capture basically what you would capture in an IPA orthography. It's just a different character set, right? So you use a CH for a ch, whereas in the IPA, you'd use a T with that long S thing, or in the American phonological system, you'd use a C with a hatchet over it, et cetera, et cetera. But I don't think effectively in terms of the transcription, there's not much of a difference in its impact. Okay. So here's the impact of this corpus size on the CER. And Jiatang did this by just running the same training on different size of corpora. So you can see, once you're starting to get a reasonable amount. Recently, Jiatang and Dan, I got used Totonac data 10 hours, and they got to 13.7 CER. So we're already now what we were at 20 hours a year ago, right? And there's obviously variation. I think for Arabic they got to 8.6 with 10 hours, but under 10 CER, the quicker we can get to the point where we just want to take scores and scores of hours of stuff, use the ASR, get it into ELAN, and then have a native speaker correct it. Okay. So this is I always like to put at least one cartoon in my talks. Error rate. I guess you can see this. I can see this. I'm not quite sure I would refer to it as an error rate. And I mean, we're obviously going to use CER. We're not going to start developing new terminology, but what we're really talking about is a discrepancy rate, right? How much does the ASR hypothesis differ from what you're calling the gold standard? So the question is, how accurate is the gold standard? Now, for something like LibreSpeech, it was developed, I think it's 906 or maybe more now, more than 1,000 hours. It was read, I think, from audiobooks and other things, and it's very easy. So the joke here is that, like, it's really not that challenging. There's a lot more challenging types of signals in the real world, but there, the gold standard, we know it's correct because people are reading it. Maybe there's a few mispronunciations or something like that that filter through, but there's basically, we want to get to the gold standard, right? And the gold standard is an accurate transcription of what the speech was. Okay, so here's some of the problems with creating a gold standard that is actually standard. These are 6 different ways of writing the word for the verb to sweep in Mishtek. The first one might be considered the canonical form, dikuchi. The K is the velar stop is voice. Most people say diguchi, but we don't have a G in the orthography, so we'd probably never write that. Okay, because when people are taught to teach, but they might write this diuchi. Okay, and there might be some vowel harmonization here, do, and do. So you have all these different possibilities. And a lot of times, which one somebody takes will be sort of a personal preference. So we were training a novice speaker, and he kept on writing diuchi like this, diuchi, whereas my native speaker expert was already writing dikuchi, right? And the acoustic signal was this all the time, right? Or not all the time, but a lot of the times the novice was much more accurate in a certain way in terms of that. And if you have that type of system, you're going to take a lot of variation. Words are going to be the same, words might be spelled different ways. Okay, so that's one thing. Let's look at the we did an experiment. Again, I'd like to thank Jia Tang, where I had 3 native speakers who I've been working with for a long time transcribe the same, I think it was an hour and a half of Nawat. And comparing one to the other, we saw fairly high error rates or discrepancy rates, let's call it that. So the question is, if we have a goal transcription, we have Hermelindo get a 9.7 CER. We have Seferino get a 10.0 CER. What would the ASR get? So in a certain way, thinking about it in a different way, if the computer is 8% off from Amelia, they're actually doing better than another human would do. Okay, that's also something to consider. So what I'm doing with the Nawat is actually going over all the transcriptions, which is a lot, which is 200 hours, and trying to just say at least there's one person who's standardizing it or correcting it. And a lot of times the differences will be quite minor, right? Like tomorrow, and somebody will write T-O, T-O, tomorrow, and somebody will write just T, T, et cetera, et cetera. So we don't really know what type of errors are being recorded when we compare the ASR to the transcription. And let me continue. Let me just show you another complication, and I don't, these are just different, the complication of the tonal phonology of Mishtek. And I hope you can hear this, Jita. Shinji, you can tell me if it's.
Nama, 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 nama.
Okay,
Nama.
so those are 24 tonal variations, contrast sets on the same segment. There are actually two that I didn't record that we just thought of, which were the completive. But the question is, how does an ASR system get the tones right? And that's a question that I guess I should have with Shinji later. Is it based on a language model? So the distribution of these is not going to be equal. Some of them might never occur in a corpus, or the corpus would have to be very, very large. Whereas other things like the word for soap or the word for wall might be very common. So that's just, this is an example of a real life situation where we recorded. The way this was done was that we applied the ASR first to an audio that had not been transcribed, and then we got, I asked Ray to correct the ASR output. And I think you can see that there's not that many corrections. So let's just.
Constantino Teodoro Bautista.
Okay.
Here we see the only two errors are in Spanish names. So tele is telesfero, and it was transcribed as tela, which is cloth. And here is Niku Valentin was transcribed as D, which is a subordinator, covalentin. Okay. Here, the next one is completely correct.
Okay.
Here, I thought this was hypercorrection on Ray's part because he corrected it. The expert is the expert. He put in the enclitic for the inanimate third person singular, and it's actually there. I'll just play. You can hear just before the me, you can hear the A there. I hadn't heard it until I did that. Let's look at the next one. Here, the expert corrected the ASR, but the ASR was correct. Okay, he put in based on his understanding. And then when I asked him to retranscribe it, and I just sent him this clipping, he transcribed it as the ASR had done. Actually, he made a different error, but then corrected it to that. So the ASR was correct here, and the expert was wrong. Okay, so that's going to happen a lot in situations like this. So your character error rate might not be an error rate of the ASR system. It might be an error rate of the expert, right? And we might be catching stuff. I won't go through here's a Coco, which is Spanish. This is actually a habitual form. And here, let's just do the last one. The only difference here is the tone. And I would never, I mean, it's hard to hear, but let's just.
La tuneye da diciande ante evanora sion duan ya kuiwa.
4-2 instead of 4-3. I'm sorry.
Constantino Teodoro Bautista.
Oops. I'm sorry. Okay. One of the other things we looked at was, at first we thought we could use ASR and compare it to how a novice did. And we found that a novice and an ASR system made different types of errors, right? So these are the errors that were made. And you could see that the novice was much better in parsing out the enclitics, but much worse in parsing out the prefixes. The glottal stop, the ASR system was much better in hearing the glottal stop. The parentheses, which is almost a mathematical formula, the ASR system got it right, much, much more. So what stem final tones are being elided in a form that has an enclitic. The tone, the ASR system was much better, etc. So the question was, can we combine these systems? So we did two ways of combining them. One was to take all three and use a rover system based on voting, and this is what we got. The other one was saying that if the tone is different, and we have two systems, the novice and the transformer, I think we used, but maybe it was the other one, select always the ASR, because we've seen that the ASR is more accurate in terms of tonal transcription. So Giottar again developed a way of comparing the two and seeing which category it went into and selecting the one for the final hypothesis based on the relative accuracy of either the novice or the end-to-end system. And you can see that one thing was interesting in what we call the noise test. The novice was very good and the ASR was very bad, right? So that says that if we want to get a final transcription, parts could be relied on using a native speaker transcriber. Okay. This is another test we did on Yoloshochitl Mishtek. We had different targets, more and morpheme word, 4 different BPEs, byte parent codings, and then different combination systems based on rover. And what we see is that there was no need to use more morpheme or word, right? Consistently worse than the BP. Among the BP, there was very little difference, at least for me. I don't know, somebody says there's very little difference, and that the rover system here was pretty good. The difference between I and J is that J adds the linguistic analysis outputs to the voting system. There was very little difference. So sort of the conclusion is there, just use B, and depending upon the amount of effort it takes, either do BP 500 or get all of them together and combine them in a voting system in rover and get this. But this is sort of the best we got, right, for at that point, and that was a year ago, so it's probably could be improved now. But we got about 7% error rate in terms of characters. And as again, I would say that not all those errors are errors of the ASR system. They might be errors of the gold standard. Okay. Now in terms of the extrinsic versus intrinsic evaluation, here we have these are 4 different corpora: the reference, the expert transcribed corpora, the field botany corpora, which were recordings taken out in the field while we're collecting pants, and video transcriptions. And these are the CER and WER that we got to. And this was the impact on the number of hours it took. So the field botany, it took Ray 8.76 hours. And I think we had maybe 300 recordings. It was a significant, maybe 20 hours. And we went from maybe 40 to 8 hours. So it's a 75 or 80% reduction in the amount of time it took a native speaker to produce in ELAN a very accurate transcription, right? And that's very significant, right, in terms of an extrinsic task. Okay. And we can start creating very large corpora for that. The remaining challenges, comparative corpora creation. If we develop it for Yoloshochitl, can we develop corpora for other Mixtec languages? I don't have enough time, so I won't go into the difficulties of that. But basically, it's related to the tonal phonology and how difficult it is to go from one Mixtec language to the other and quickly get the tonal phonology correct. Let me just, okay. So summary of endangered language documentation effect on ASR. Endangered languages are low resource. So there's the challenge of low resources. The audio is often recorded in less than optimal situations. So a lot of computational linguists who might be asked by a endangered language documentarian to, hey, can you help me transcribe this? They give them stuff that's really bad, right? And, you know, I've gotten that. I was asked to once transcribe a prisoner conversation in Nahuatl over the phone. I couldn't understand a word. It was such bad recording. But anyway, again, the transcriptions may be of varying quality, completeness, and standardization. So the same person might write the word 4 different ways on the same page. And the other major impact is endangered language documentation orients ASR to extrinsic evaluation, right? How much does ASR help us get to our goal, which is language documentation, rather than how low can we get the character error rate or the word error rate? Okay, and that is it. I apologize. I seem to have taken up a lot of time, but maybe there are questions. Is that?
Yep. Thank you,
some-
Jonathan.
Okay.
Very good talk. Yes, that maybe we can accept some questions from the audience.
I have a question about the writing system. How standardized is it? Is it standardized? How literate are speakers of the language?
Well, for Mixtec, nobody writes it. I write with, nobody writes. I mean, I write tones with numbers. It's not done too much. I don't know if it's a big problem. So like we're right now working with Veracruz, Nahuatl, and people use a TZ instead of a TS. They use a J instead of an H. They don't write vowel length. I don't consider those particularly problematic. You know, if the writing systems are different. Obviously, one of the big impacts would be if they don't write tone, right? So if you're evaluating your effectiveness of your ASR system, and in Mixtec you don't write tone, it might be a lot easier to get very low error rates, right? So
Yeah.
that might be same with vowel length in Nahuatl. So you might have problematical aspects of the phonology that are not written. It doesn't matter so much how it's written or how it's not written, but is it written? So I think that's the big question. The other question, so in Mixtec, they'll use diacritics for tones, and they basically use 3, maybe 4. But if you have 13 tones in a language, I don't know what that impact might be on ASR, but obviously you're underrepresenting a lot of contrasts. And, you know, will that confuse things, or will that make the ASR, the error rates go down or go up? I don't know. I don't know what the impact would be, but I don't usually think that the orthography would have that much of an impact. And working with different speakers who have different orthographies. With Nahuatl, there's no problem in teaching the orthography that I use, and if they even keep the same one, it doesn't matter. With Mixtec, it is a big problem, right? That sometimes I don't trust the tonal phonology of people who are transcribing.
Okay. Thanks.
Other questions?
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, Neto, go ahead.
Thank you for the presentation. I was just wondering, can you talk a little bit about how you chose Nahuatl and Mixtec? Are they well suited for this problem, or was there just kind of an interest generally from, I guess, your funder?
No, I mean, so not what I started out, I was interested in Aztec literature. And so I got interested in Nahuatl. I said, it's ridiculous to study Aztec literature if you don't speak a word of Nahuatl. So I said, I got to learn Nahuatl. And I gradually drifted into, documenting, getting a lot of materials, just doing the standard transcribing by hand, et cetera, and I went to NSF meeting. It was called Aardvark, basically putting together field linguists with computation linguists and seeing if they could work together. And nobody wanted to work with anybody. That was sort of, I wouldn't say that's sort of unfair, but it's not always together and say, okay, get rid of your research right now, put it on hold and do this collaborative project. Can you hear me, by the way? Just raise your, yeah, okay. So but I'm basically unemployed, right? I mean, I'm an independent scholar. So I was like all enthusiastic about, hey, I can work with computational linguists and develop ASR and do things. And I got in touch with SRI International through people at the Haskins Laboratory. And we did the hidden Markov model. We did the sort of the probabilistic study for ASR on that, I guess I'm getting. And then when we reapplied from Mishtec to do Nawat, we were basically told that things had changed and we were like just doing like last year's methodology, that everybody now is doing neural networks and hidden Markov models. Just forget it. It was just, wasn't even competitive. So Vikram, a friend, mutual friend with Shinji and myself, introduced me to Shinji. Now, why I do Nawat? So Nawat, my original interest in pre-Hispanic literature. Mishtec, I got interested in because the Ford Foundation asked me to advise a project in Guerrero, in Eastern Guerrero, and work on Nawat, Mishtec, and Tlapanec. And I got interested in Mishtec through that. The project didn't go forward, but I had a friend who was a linguist who had an amazing student. And so I started working on Mishtec with him. Totonac I started working on because we're doing ethnobotany, and I met this biologist who's Totonac speaker, who's incredible. And so we're doing ethnobotany, but we're also documenting the language. And then now I'm working on Musco, Triqui, Mazatec, Tlapanec, because I'm doing comparative ethnobotany of those languages, of communities speaking that language, and they're native speaker linguists who I'm collaborating with. So we're sort of killing two birds with one stone. One is documenting the floristic knowledge, but at the same time develop corpora, hopefully in the future to then provide that corpora to those corpora to computational linguists so they can start working on ASR. And that's already been done for Totonac, and I had it up there where you got a 0.7 from 10 hours of Totonac. So hopefully in the future we can do Mazatec and Tlapanec and the other Ottoman languages that I'm working on.
Could I just follow up? I think if I understand right, you use these end-to-end transformer and conformer ASR models to do the Nahuatl recognition. And could you essentially apply just that same framework to those other languages you mentioned?
I would say so, but that's better answered by Shinji or Jiatong. I would see no reason why not, but I really have to, I would say hopefully, right? I mean, the idea is to do it, but I think they're constantly changing the way they develop their end-to-end system and the different types of, I think when we were doing Mishtec on speech augmentation, if that Jiatong can interrupt me or something like that, if it was it, and they applied that and he was very excited. Oh, we got our CR down, 10% just by using data augmentation methods that had been developed by Google for ASR. So that's constantly being changed. And, I think that now Shinji is using multilingual models to try to develop ASR systems for very low resource languages. But again, I shouldn't even said that because I might be putting my foot in my mouth.
Yeah, maybe I can just say something. So I think, yes, Jonathan is generally like like in the right direction. So basically, we are kind of trying to develop more like techniques into this ASR problem like recently, and also like working on fusing some like self-supervised features and so on, like to help with this endangered language documentation, especially for the low resource ones and so on. So I think it's currently like we're still like developing our like technical stack to incorporating more of the technology and also like for specifically this problem. So basically this problem we can regard it as a ASR problem, but in some sense we also need to kind of depend on some specifics like the linguistic perspective and also like how the transcription is working and so on. So that is kind of also dependent over the cases in some cases. Yeah.
Yeah, one thing is that I'm not sure where low resource ends and high resource or mid resource begins. But one of the problems is, let's say for Masatec, we have 20 hours now, and hopefully we'll have 20 hours of transcriptions. If you look at other endangered languages projects, there's very little material out there. And when I was trying to do transfer learning of Mixtec, and I contacted every Mixtec scholar that I could get my hands on, I don't think anybody had more than an hour worth of transcription. I mean, so that's why we didn't do transfer learning of Mixtec, because it was a pain to I mean, there was nothing out there, right? There was no annotated data that was reasonable. One of the questions I had included in this talk is using neural networks to try to cluster tonal patterns in different languages. So if you take cognate sets from 5 different Mixtec languages, is there a standard variation in tonal patterns? So you can say that a high-low in Yoloshochit Mixtec is a high-medium in this language or something like that. Do the clusters that are based on cognate sets seem to accurately represent the clusters that might be based on picture contours? Right? If that makes sense. But there's very little data out there in Mixtec.
Thank you.
There's a question in the chat, by the way, which is in some tonal language ASR evaluation, there's a syllable error rate, which is just word error rate without tones. Is this ever used with Mixtec, and would it be helpful?
You know, I think when I was working with SRI International, there was some interest in separating out the different recognition patterns. So I remember that one of the things we were very interested in is nasalization, like how accurate and how does an ASR system recognize nasalization? And I don't know. I spoke to several experts on nasalization, and they said that it's not that easy to see in the acoustic signal. But when you have these black boxes that are these neural networks and you get right answer, one of the questions I always had, why are you getting a right answer? Are you getting a right answer because of something more connected with the language models? So we looked at the nama, right? All the different tones on that. Correct tone on that, is that because 90% of the namas that are in our corpus are 4/4s, and therefore the ASR just says it's probably 4/4 because it is, that's what's there, or what's the relationship between sort of the occurrence probability. So your question is recognizing the syllables without tone and how accurate that is?
Whether, well, I'm just reading a question off the chat. It's actually not my question, but whether syllable error rate can be used basically to measure word error rate, ignoring the tones, and if that would be helpful with evaluation.
So when you say syllable error rate, you mean the syllable without the tonal marking?
I believe that's correct.
Yeah, I mean, Jiatang has more experience with the data there and stuff like that. In one of the things we looked at, we did look at the different, you know, how many errors were tonal errors So you can see, I mean, I don't know exactly the thing. Obviously, if we eliminated tones, I don't know if it makes a difference if we use syllable, matching up syllables or words. I mean, obviously you're getting different error rates based on the different size of the units. But maybe I don't understand the question, but if you eliminate the tones and you evaluate it, I think that your recognition rate will eliminate a whole bunch of errors, right? But maybe I'm not understanding.
Yeah, I think I can say something for this question specifically. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
for
the
the
network keeps going down.
Yours as well.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So,
Yours looks okay.
I see.
sorry,
So it
folks,
seems
just
that
to
for
interrupt there. The network keeps going down in GHC, so some people are getting knocked off and coming back again.
Okay.
I see. I see.
So Jiatang?
Yes, so I think for the word error rate is actually calculated with the tones. So actually, we regarded like the specific words with tones as specific one word there. So in that sense, it's kind of the case is kind of just using one word with tone. So it's just like it's something similar to the like Chinese Mandarin recognition as well. So basically, we are regarding each character as a specific unit that with tones to be considered together to be evaluated. And actually, we also do some like case like we, instead of doing the BPE, like extracting that, we use the syllables to do the recognition there. And it actually, the result is quite similar, I would say, but it's in somewhat is like lower, like worse than the BPE result in our experiment. So that we still can keep using the BPE for like for training the model instead of using
Okay. So here, yeah, there's this.
Yeah, I think at the time we are calling Mora for the syllables, right?
Syllable.
Jonathan, I think.
Yeah. So the
Yeah.
more is just an onset with the the nucleus, the vowel nucleus, right? I mean, that's
Yes.
the mora. And I guess
Yes.
there's not too many codas, but that's it. So it's a CV or a optional onset, and that's the mora. I would guess that the mora now bimoraic syllables would be considered two mora, so there's that difference. But I think you can see here that the mora, you know, it didn't really increase it made the system worse to include linguistic information.
Are there any more questions? Okay, let's all thank Jonathan for his presentation.
Thank you so much, Jonathan.
Thank you all. And it's been a pleasure, and I hope to visit sometime soon.
Sure.
We hope to see you here. Yes, it'd be nice.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Graham, do you want to say anything about next week?